镇压人民生活更高，使蒋介石更高，使蒋介石国民党华等生活摆平守国，勾结帝国主义，华文化革命建设。
The accusations of being against the government, of being against communism, to be accused of that was a fate worse than death, really, because they were still true communists in their hearts.
For many years, I had promised my father I want to painting his portrait. He was in his late 80s when he said for me, this is really give us a valuable time and sit together, talk about his life. By the end of that day, my father asked me to write down his life story for the Western readers.
His early childhood was, I suppose, probably very traumatic for a child whose father had left him. He obviously didn't understand why he felt abandoned. His mother had died very soon after childbirth, brought up by a grandmother whom he loved very much, I think, always found her kind-hearted, but the whole family fell on hard times, and the grandmother kept everybody going. And then eventually his father, who had made it in life as an army officer, came back to fetch him. And I think that was a turning point in his life.
The first major chunk of the book is called Turning China Red. And that was in fact an early possible sort of title for the book. And it really is the story of the family as they are working towards what is clearly on the horizon, which is the rise of communism.
You know, people asking, why you want to write your father's story? What did your father do? When I said, okay, my father's a communist, and people said, okay.
He was set on the path towards communism initially by his father, and then by his future mother-in-law, whom he adored upon meeting. And we suspect that his father was obviously in love with Chen Yanxi as well.
I came to know my grandmother was a famous double-gun woman while I was in the primary school. And that time, only once I had my sister told me and said our Waipo, our grandmother, was double-gun woman. Because double-gun woman, it was heroine that time. Everybody know double-gun woman. She shooting with two hands.
The double-gun woman had obviously led a very colourful past in guerrilla warfare in the Huaying Mountains with her former husband, who had been killed by the nationalists, and Ping's father met her for the first time when she was in prison, and he was very struck by her, as everybody was who met her. She seemed to be a natural leader. She thought of other people's welfare, not of her own, and this was obviously exactly what Ping's grandfather also, his philosophy in life. They never thought of themselves, they were always thinking for the good of other people.
As my father described his father, he has a name, as people called him that time a lunatic Lin. Because his character, he's so upright and his idea, and the society should be equal, and no bullies, no corruptions.
He worked so hard his whole life, but at every turn he seemed to be thwarted. His ambitions were to be a tennis player. He was excellent at everything he did. Other ambitions to be a journalist and a writer. He kept writing his whole life, it seems, but as an underground communist, he then gave over his whole life, his life and soul, to the Communist Party, just waiting for their orders, carrying them out to the best of his ability, and in the meantime trying to raise a family.
You give everything to the party, you give your life to the party. I think they made this promise, and this truly to do anything for the party. And there was once I asked my father, I said, Papa, if your revolution, the party or your revolution need you to give up your children, would you do that? I remember really clearly my father's looking at the ceiling. He was, then he said, at that time, I would. We would. In fact, we gave up our first child, your big sister, none of yours you made. Because we've been chasing all the time, we've been wanted all the time. We flee, we run away, and that time we just couldn't bring in your big sister. We couldn't take her with us. And when we return, and I only been taken to her little grave.
It was tragic that baby Binhua didn't have a very long life, and he must have blamed himself, because he said it was his idea to leave her behind with relatives while they had to travel quickly to escape capture, and I suspect he's never forgiven himself for that.
Zhang Bai's story, in a way, is somebody whose left-wingness goes right back to the very basic kind of the idea that the feudal system was corrupt and oppressive, and that you should replace that by people governing themselves.
The life is just unbearable. People like in the 30s, their back is hunching so much because they have the pulling, working that so bad. But he believed what his father said, that there shouldn't be any classes difference. Everybody should be equal, should be the same.
It's reminding people, which I think does get forgotten, is what was it that made this philosophy so appealing in the first place? What were people's lives like that they were prepared to make this momentous change?
They were thinking party, the communists, the party is like their own mother. They are the child of this big idea.
I suppose in terms of the narrative, 1949 and the post-liberation is the kind of emotional core of the book. He's, as he said, in his early 30s, he's lost family members, he's lost comrades, and the communists come to power, and almost immediately there is a sense that the revolution that they thought they were fighting for is not delivering what they expected.
1949, I suppose, should have been the culmination of all their work, their hopes and dreams. But human nature, I think, probably got in the way. Everybody didn't share the high ideals that they'd been working for, and it was soon down to everybody for themselves.
But it's a new China, peaceful and beautiful society.
He is kind of outed as a rightist. He loses his position. He's humiliated.
Corruption started all over again from a different set of people.
The factionalism that they were, they had fought. They'd fought the Kuomintang. They'd won the war. They had They had suffered greatly, people had died, people had been captured, tortured, killed, and finally the liberation happened.
He was named as a rightist, and consequently anything he did was against communism, apparently, even though he was still pure of heart. And he was eventually sent to labour camps, and his life spiralled into just the fight for survival.
You know, people who had formerly been heroes were suddenly anti-heroes.
They were betrayed in the fact that they were the intellectuals, and they didn't realise that they had already become the enemy. And it took many, many years to realise why things happened to them, why they were persecuted themselves.
Fought through adversity, welcomed the new life, thought peace had come forever. Instead, dark nightmares arrived. Is this right? Is that wrong? Is it bad? Is it good? All hard to classify. Is it a man or is it a ghost? No one can tell. To live, to die, is all up to the slaughterer. Perpetual conflict, daily struggle. Do I fight for you to die or me to survive? Too many mothers-in-law. Various temple gates, kowtow to this one, salute to the other. Speak lies, hide guilt. Tell the truth, you will be tackled. Why stir up trouble? Be deaf, be dumb, and you may be safe.
Persecution, arrest, jobs being taken away from them, and so their salaries being reduced until they're completely poverty-stricken, and the accusations of being against the government, of being against communism, which it seemed to them was a worse to be accused of that was a fate worse than death, really, because they were still true communists in their hearts.
You know, when my parents being sent away to the labor camp, my sister and my brother went to Beijing thinking they can, you know, meet in Joe and I to report my family, my parents being treated injustice.
Ping's mother, at least, certainly refused to admit that she was nothing but a true communist, as they were trying to make her confess. And she was particularly badly treated.
This is my mother's diary. This is the old journey Cultural Revolution. It's from 1967. Lin Xiangbei. I'm the rightist. I'm the worst rightist of all the rightists.
During interrogation, she was forced to kneel on cinders and pressed down so that they dug into her. She had a board hung from her neck by a very thin wire, so it cut into her skin, proclaiming that she's, you know, all her so-called crimes, and I believe probably a huge conical hat that was put on her head, also very heavy. And she was very ill at this stage of her life with diabetes, without any treatment for it, and apparently she was often fainting. Nobody gave her treatment. Whereas Ping's father was trying to be a bit more pragmatic, and he, rather than riling his accusers, he would try and always smooth the waters and just to survive, so that he could return to his children who'd been left on their own to fend for themselves.
I was too little. Nobody can look after me, so my mother just decided I've been, you know, just giving away to people. And I feel now, I think I was just like a parcel being passed around to the different families, to people who have no children. So my mother just makes sure I can get enough food to living with them, or to kind of foster, they can become my foster family, or become my, to give me away.
During winter, they were running around trying to sell newspapers, bare feet in the frost, and having no news of how any of the family was surviving.
Unfortunately, Chairman Mao didn't come to my rescue, nor to others in the same boat as me. I hung my head even lower than before.
This is my mother on the stage and performs. I mean, her life, she wanted to be a performance artist.
A huge event in their lives was the death of the mother, and tragically from ill health, undiagnosed or untreated diabetes leading to liver failure and all sorts of other things that are associated with untreated diabetes. But it was a very long and drawn out last few years. She suffered greatly. And it was a very moving account of her death. Very soon after that, I suppose, life did improve greatly on the death of Chairman Mao, because then it allowed the people who've been dubbed as rightist to be reinstated into the Communist Party one by one.
The Cultural Revolution was brought to a close by the death of Chairman Mao on 9th of September 1976, the trial of the Gang of Four in October. I was reinstated to the Communist Party in 1978, constantly given the job of Chairman of Workers' Union at the Sichuan Electricity Company. 2 years later, at the age of 63, I retired. I will say, once again, to survive is victory.
Ping's father was instrumental in helping a lot of people in Sichuan province of being reinstated into the party, and it obviously gave him a lot of joy to finally call himself a communist again.
I suppose I've had the conversation with some people saying, do I think he's naive to have retained his faith? On some levels, yeah, that's clearly the case. He's been, he's had to suffer so much. But on other levels, is it naive to figure out that actually, in the end, his values are values that and I think millions of other people all over the world would subscribe to. They're values that at least apparently have inspired our democracies as well. What I get from the book is 100 years of a human being's life living through and a record of it in a way that doesn't end up becoming bitter or angry.
Just so passionate about their ideals, and such pure, high ideals. I don't think many of us think like that in the West, actually.
Although his views are political, I think they're sort of deeper humanist views than they are kind of narrowly Marxist. And I think the problem always comes is that Marxism was capable of being interpreted in so many different ways. He believed he was a patriot as well. There's a spiritual side to the way he talks and writes that is, for me, is the thing I get from him. In the midst of all this, he is still his belief in other people, in the rightness of sharing, in the rightness of trying to make other people's lives better, trying to lift other people out of poverty, trying to see the good in people. He never gives up on that.
I think as a man, like my father, who experienced life so much, so many happy disasters, hardship, struggles, all he had experienced, and now he's living peacefully in his old age. I mean, he's so happy. He said that he can live for over 100. I mean, I think for my father who's have this long life, a lot of people asking, oh, what is the secret? I think one thing my father always say, your life need to have a hope.
Ping has found in this process of writing her father's memoir how now she understands what he did, why he did things, and I believe he told her at the outset that if you write up his memoir in and present it to the Western world, she will then come to understand his generation and what happened in China. And I think that's very true. Ping has now come to terms with what happened in her earlier life.
So you feel, it feels in the end like a family story at the end of the book, which is how it started. And although you've been through all these great historical events, at the end it's what he has around him is what gives him pleasure, the people who love him. To survive is victory.